Hello, everyone. We're going to start with the second part.
No. Do not do the air horn.
No.
The air horn is evil.
Hello.
Where's Mark?
Mark is coming. There you go.
Oh my God, David. How should I do this?
Let's unplug this. Oh, yes, I'm going to introduce you. Do not worry about my computer. I'm
Okay.
just going to leave it here.
Well, I'll just try not to destroy it. Actually, I'm gonna get my clicker. I think people are still coming in, so I'm just gonna give it to them.
All right, we're going to start with the second part. This is the last part of the last GAC. That is the last activity. We made it.
This is why you had to say 15 minutes. This is why you had to say 15 minutes.
Yeah. All right, our next speaker is a postdoc at Princeton University and NYU. And he's going to talk, he gave a wonderful talk on Friday about controls and planning. I will ask you to join me in welcoming Mark Ho.
All right. Hello. We're getting started. Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm Mark, and yeah, thanks so much to Herman and Malcolm and David and everybody for getting this together and kind of bringing us all together to talk about planning. It seems like a very timely topic since a lot of people are kind of thinking about these issues and how they relate to AI as it becomes more kind of sophisticated. So the kind of topic of this GAC is to think about planning, and when we think about planning and we think about kind of creatures that plan, humans are one creature that plans, and we do this all the time. We plan when we're navigating a new city or playing games or creating new recipes and stuff. But what is planning? Like, I think we've talked about some ways of thinking about planning and good examples of what planning is at the GAC and throughout this conference. And we just heard two amazing talks about planning, like modern planning approaches to thinking about planning. And they really are coming at planning from this kind of very, very modern view of kind of thinking about learning and machine learning as a kind of statistical process, as a kind of process of estimating some like optimal value function or through interaction with an environment, estimating like the optimal policy and value function. And from this perspective, planning is really, it's another mechanism for making that statistical estimator more efficient for example, through constructing a model or something like that, through model-based reinforcement learning. But there's actually a much older kind of perspective on planning that really goes back to what is sometimes called good old-fashioned AI, or GOFI. And kind of the GOFI view, it predates the kind of statistical machine learning view and kind of was superseded by it in the last 20, 30 years because it only got so far. But the GOFI view really is what gives us, what kind of originally formulated this whole idea of planning and thinking about planning. And the GOFI view really, this isn't any one official's definition, it's just a definition I'm putting out there, but the GOFI view, I would argue, really thinks about planning in terms of symbolic reasoning in the service of action selection. And you might be saying, okay, Mark, well, you're trying to define planning, now you're defining it in terms of these other things that are not, totally agreed on either, symbols, reasoning. But, in the context of planning, I would argue these things are quite well-defined. And in particular, the symbols in planning are things like abstract causal models, compositional models, and the types of algorithms we think about in planning are things like tree search or various forms of dynamic programming or approximations of dynamic programming. And so I want to talk a little bit about this kind of view of representation and algorithm and kind of the relationship between these two things in the context of planning, because I think it provides like a complementary view to thinking about planning from the kind of outside view of like a statistical estimator, and kind of lets us think more about, okay, what's going on inside the cognitive processes that are occurring when we're talking about something like planning. And so this idea of representation in algorithm is something I've been thinking a lot about lately, and I think it's quite powerful, and it really has an old history again. It kind of is at the core of how we think about computation in a lot of ways. Things like a Turing machine, it has a tape, it has a data structure, a tape, and then it's a kind of machine that operates over that tape. There's kind of classic books on programming that think about programming as kind of in terms of data structures and algorithms that operate over those. And then, in computer science, people often talk about space versus time, complexity of space versus time, and how those things trade off in the design of algorithms. And in psychology and cognitive science and neuroscience, algorithms and representations have also played an important role in how we think about explaining behavior. And in particular, there's this kind of old argument from John Anderson in the 70s that really we can never really talk about representation without talking about algorithm. Anytime you make a claim about representation, you can't actually test it without linking it to some algorithm. So there's this kind of fundamental indeterminacy of behavior. And so we need to be talking about both of these things. And these are kind of goes back to kind of classic debates about the nature of mental imagery, and also more recent debates about semantic memory. And more relevant to the particular topic of problem solving, there's kind of this complementary thing of thinking about, okay, well, there's, if you're going to solve a problem, there's many ways in which you can kind of form a combination of representation and algorithm that solves a problem. What Herb Simon called functional equivalence of like problem-solving skills. And so I've been really thinking about kind of, how can we think about kind of problem-solving and planning from a human perspective in these terms of representation and algorithm. And I talked a little bit on Thursday about some of the work that we've been doing, thinking about value-guided construal and construal set, persistence and rigidity, in terms of this, dichotomy of representation and algorithm. So yeah, we can talk about that later on, but I also want to kind of touch on some other work, which I think, presents another kind of important case study in thinking about how, in the context of action selection and, acting in the world, adaptively responding and behaving in the world, how this kind of interaction between representations of the world and algorithms for computing how you're going to act in the world are really important, and that's hierarchical planning. And so I really love this, this picture from Saul Steinberg, which is called The View of the World from Ninth Avenue, because I really think it captures the idea that anytime we are kind of solving a problem that is larger than a relatively small grid world or a two-step task or something like that, we have to represent the world at multiple scales of abstraction. We have to represent the problem we're solving at multiple scales of abstraction, and we have to kind of coordinate those over time. And this idea of hierarchical planning and hierarchical reinforcement learning, and so on, it's relatively familiar. People have studied it for a while in neuroscience and cognitive science. But we can ask, like, okay, where does this hierarchy come from? Why do we have this hierarchy, and how does it exist in the context of planning? What does it actually give us? So I want to talk about some work that I've been a part of, led by Carlos Correa, who's a grad student at Princeton, and we've been really thinking about okay, how can we think about representations of tasks, kind of decompositions of tasks, in a way that really takes into account this kind of interplay of the representation of a problem, or possible representations of a problem, and the execution of an algorithm. And the kind of key idea that we've been trying to develop is that subgoals, a kind of key determinant of subgoals and subgoal, subtask representations, is that they structure the execution of algorithms, kind of like planning algorithms that we typically talk about, things like tree search or whatever. And so the basic idea is that we can kind of take a big task, like a big, what we call monolithic task, and decompose it into a set of smaller, more manageable tasks. And then we kind of reason about the interactions between those tasks, and then how we might solve those individual tasks. And to kind of give an example of this, you can think about, okay, let's say we're running an A-star search algorithm from a starting point, which is the green square here, and we're trying to get to this yellow point, which is the goal point, which is the yellow square over there. And we kind of roll out using a heuristic, kind of Euclidean distance heuristic, possible nodes. We hit a wall, and then we kind of expand out and then have to search around it. This process, it's relatively efficient, but it's not the most efficient. If you introduce a subgoal, which is this blue tile over here, that can dramatically reduce the complexity of the number of nodes that you have to unpack in order to plan to the yellow final goal. And so this is just to give an intuition of how we're thinking about this from a kind of resource rational perspective, how we can think about this like interplay between representations and algorithms in the context of hierarchical planning and kind of scaling up planning to more complicated domains. So we're here to talk about what is the place of planning, and kind of bringing up this view that planning can really be understood as symbolic reasoning in the service of action selection. And I talked a little bit about this idea of representation and algorithm, and kind of the role that's played in kind of our understanding of computation and intelligence and computational views of intelligence. And I really think that in order to understand like planning from the inside, the type of planning that humans are doing on the inside and other animals are doing, we really have to understand these mechanisms in terms of the combination of algorithm and representation that constitute them. Because planning is really kind of the epitome of kind of complex representations of the world and complex algorithms that operate over those representations. And I think it would be like a really exciting kind of, the exciting big question right now is how do we integrate this kind of classical view of planning with the more modern statistical view of kind of optimizing an estimator on a task. And then I talked a little bit about kind of recent work on planning and representation, the value guided control stuff, and then also kind of this view of hierarchical planning as kind of a way to think about how representations kind of structure the execution of algorithms. So thanks to the collaborators on the work I talked about, Tom Griffith, Jonathan Cohen, Michael Littman, Nathaniel Daw, David Abel, Carlos Correa, and Fred Calloway. Thank you for listening, and questions. I guess we're doing questions. Yes? No? Okay.
Do we have any questions? No question.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, okay.
Let's go.
So, actually, two questions. So, one, could you elaborate a bit more on how you think of integrating Does it work, or should I complete? Okay, so could you speak a bit more on like how you think about integrating sort of symbolic, good old-fashioned AI systems with sort of like this more modern neural network style approaches that are very present, dominant around here? So whether you actually think of hybrid approaches, or do you think of like sort of giving some kind of more a priori structure to the kind of networks we are talking about? This would be one question. And according for your hierarchical planning, so I was wondering, you showed sort of this very simple grid rule where sort of like if you have this intermediate goal at the bottom before you sort of like then head over, it comes down to sort of like how do I define sort of like the right intermediate problem? So could you speak a bit more on that, of like how I find it? Because if I sort of like have to expand the entire thing to find a good intermediate problem, then I probably won't save as much anymore. So these two, thanks.
Yeah, definitely. So the first question is about, I guess, how do we combine kind of more statistical approaches and these more structured reasoning approaches? So that's a very active area of research right now, kind of thinking about neurosymbolic systems. I think from an engineering perspective, we just have to try out a lot of things to get it to work. But I think, a lot of what the kind of recent advances in deep RL and deep neural networks and so on have shown is that you can do a lot with kind of representation learning, and that representation learning, we've kind of like come really far in terms of learning representations of problems. Like that's kind of what a way to understand like a neural network is, kind of learning a set of features or a function approximator or something like that. I think the question is, how do we kind of do representation learning alongside either running an algorithm or learning an algorithm at the same time? And there are a lot of approaches at play right now for doing that. I don't know the exact best one, but it seems like we're at a very different point in time now, or a different place we were like, when good old-fashioned AI was big, because we now have we have great ways of kind of doing representation learning. And so I think, maybe we should start going back and thinking more about the algorithm at this point. And the second question was about, the hierarchical planning formulation. So, right, I think the way to think about it is, so like if you're only going to be solving a single task and finding a single subgoal, then it's not really, it's hard. It's just as hard to kind of find the optimal subgoal as it is to solve the problem overall. But kind of amortize over a bunch of tasks, it's useful to find you can find subgoals that kind of allow you to amortize the cost of planning overall. And so there's that perspective, and then there's also the perspective of, well, maybe we have useful priors based on our understanding of the structure of the world for kind of identifying subgoal structures. So, we're kind of walking, like buildings are kind of designed so that like doors are kind of good subgoals to have if you want to exit a room. So there's, kind of environmental kind of structure can help structure subgoals, and then also this idea of amortizing over many planning problems.
Just to get an intuition about the different kinds of planning, formulations of it, in the AI talks that we saw just before yours, would any of the parts of those algorithms that you'd consider planning, are they hierarchical? Are they examples of hierarchical planning, or are they clearly not hierarchical planning? And do you think that if they implemented a different planning algorithm other than, I think it was in Monte Carlo tree search, I think was the example I remember, would it have an effect on performance, would you predict?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think from my understanding of mu0 and these recent architectures, they aren't doing hierarchical planning. They're just kind of, they roll out at each state a plan, and they're kind of doing kind of look ahead at like some fixed level of abstraction. There are hierarchical reinforcement learning algorithms, like model-free algorithms that kind of learn controllers at different level of abstraction, but they aren't doing planning. So it seems maybe you could combine those and do kind of Monte Carlo tree search at an abstract level, maybe do it at a more concrete level, and kind of coordinate those things. I haven't seen any algorithms that do that yet, but it's possible they're out there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Malcolm MacIver from Northwestern University.
Okay, thank you. So this had to come together pretty quickly, given I just gave a keynote, but hopefully it will be somewhat coherent, but mostly speculative, and hopefully some fuel for the discussion afterwards. I just thought I'd start by refreshing our memories as to some classic canonical ways of thinking about both habit and plan-based action selection from an RL perspective. And of course, that is still unclear as to how perfectly it matches biology, but nonetheless, it's a very clear starting point. And so here's an agent, an animal, for example, that has learned to associate a reward of 20 with path 2 and 30 if it goes forward and 10 if it goes right. And so under habit-based action selection or model-free, the agent learns the relative values of taking an action at that state, say at that starting point. And the action or state values are divorced from their outcome. So you get this inflexibility or automatic response aspect to habit-based action selection. Whereas under plan-based action selection, the animal is going to reference some representation of the environment, such as a map depicted here, and forward simulate the consequences of taking actions. And so this is thought to confer, this action outcome knowledge structure is thought to confer more flexible responses. And so let's then imagine this Tolman task where you have an animal needing to reroute due to a block. And so with an animal that has learned the task as a habit, it's going to reference its reward structure and go straight, hit this block, and unfortunately have to check the other path as well because that's the next highest reward value, and then finally pick the least rewarding. And of course, if this is not a goal with potentially mortal outcomes, such as maybe it's a seed as opposed to a possible going by a predator, this is not a problem. But in general, having to do this 3-branch search is oftentimes not optimal. Right. So I want to show you an example of habits. I emphasized planning with our structure, with our arena last night, but I want to show you an episode of where we think something like habit is happening. And just to review the apparatus, since some of you might have been there, and the people on Zoom haven't seen this, we have a hexagonal arena with a mouse and a robot, and there's a white noise generator, and we have the robot with the puffer, and the animal has to go from a start gate with a water reward to an end gate, and then cycle around to get back to the beginning and go through the space again. Now, I showed you trials where the robot was interceding in the animal's attempt to get to the goal, but before those trials, we trained the animals to, or didn't train them, but exposed them to different arrays of obstacles, or one environment in particular. This is subject FMM7, so female mus musculus, and you're going to see so this mouse has never experienced the robot in the arena, but has experienced the arena several times, and it does this characteristic sort of pretty much stigmatactic strategy along the walls, and it rapidly acquires the water reward, and now is going back to get another one. Now we moved these magnetic obstacles to be located in different parts of the space without telling the mouse what we were doing, and check out what it does now. Oh, what's going on? Oops, something. Oh, what? Oh, okay. Oh, what? What's going on here? Somebody's moved the furniture. So, so this is an animal that has learned some sort of habit after multiple exposures to this environment, we switched it out, and it's now having to reroute. And so this is kind of a situation that model-based planning is purported to help avoid, which is, okay, so you get a blockage, you've got your goal in mind, but you don't see the block in this case, so you go to it, but now you access your map again, and you go, hey, well, if this block is here, then path 2 is also going to be blocked, so my action outcome structure directs me to actually take this way and avoid the delay. And so the thing that happens, as David Redish will probably tell us more of, since he's done so much beautiful work on this, is that the structure of this task is habitizable, meaning that, okay, so initially, the animal might have to use a plan to solve the task, but over time, what you see is that phenomena like VTE go away, and various tests can affirm that the animal does learn a habit, because this is a static, habitizable task. And that was one of the reasons that we were motivated to pursue a different kind of task structure, one where it inherently couldn't be habitized, and that is the environment where this is the simulation snapshot, of course, where we have the mouse starting at the start gate, we have our robot predator, and we have these obstacles, and the mouse has to get over here, but the predator is constantly on the prowl. The animal doesn't know, the mouse doesn't know where the predator is, and so I'll just play this simulation again. So this is purely being simulated, and we're showing the particles that are representing where the prey thinks the predator is, and it's leveraging obstacles to find a safe path after it's minimized the uncertainty as to the location of the predator. But in that initial phase, it's like doing movement seemingly specifically, to reduce the uncertainty it has about this movable threat. Okay, so then I showed you, and I'll just show you this once more time, this particular video, in which what we've done is we've taken our simulation setup and prescribed the mouse and robot trajectory to the simulation, so it doesn't get to decide that, but we do use the belief state representation of the simulation to obtain an estimate of what the prey believes is true with respect to the robot's position over time, again indicated by those pink particles. And you can see those peaks around these obstacles where it actually is, let me actually replay that. I'm going to pause it right at the critical point here. So it saw the robot over here. Okay, so as it comes out from behind the obstacle, all of those hypotheses as to possible predator locations, other than the ones that were along this visual array, since it had just passed through here and it had cleared out those hypotheses, all of the hypotheses are removed because now it can actually get line of sight to its threat. And so what does it do next is, let me go forward, is, okay, I'm going to reroute, belief collapse, reroute, go over here, and just think about what has to be going on for this animal to so carefully place its glimpses, okay? So it's not running to the opposite wall and making its way to the goal, which is one feasible solution. What it's doing instead is it's coming over to that obstacle, doing another inspection of an open point there, coming over here, doing another inspection, and then deciding, okay, I better do an end run around these obstacles to get to my goal. All right. So this is a situation where partial observability seems to be super critical or super essential, or management of partial observability seems to be super essential to what the animal is doing. Of course, we don't know for sure. It could be a model-free approach that's working in the animal's brain. We're hoping to find that out over the next while as we start to do interventional experiments in the animal's brain. But one thing to note, even with Hamrick's paper, and I do love this paper, but one thing to note about her analysis is that she says, we note that our analysis has been limited to single task and mostly fully observable deterministic environments, and see similar studies focusing on multitask and more strongly partially observed and stochastic environments as important areas for future work. So we have to condition, some of those results on the fact that she wasn't looking at fully partially observable environment. She did a little bit of examination of them, but it wasn't the fully partially observable case. And it's really interesting to me from Jane's talk that she talked about this game alchemy where she finds the model free approach as having great difficulty is management of these latent variables. And so where I'm starting to go with this pattern of information is just how important or how essential management of latent states may be to animals in certain situations, and whether or not how well model-free algorithms can really do that problem. I'm not articulating this very well, but because I'm still trying to incorporate what Jane said, but I think there's something there in the fact that medial PFC, as we've seen some talks and David Redish has written about, seems to really be on about the problem of managing latent variables. And this is such an important structure for planning. We know that once you damage it in humans or other animals, a lot of planning is just completely vanquished. So there's something here that I think is really quite interesting. Now, I'd be remiss not to show you another partially observable leopard film. So here it is. It has a slightly different twist to it, so that's why I want to show it to you. So here is a leopard in a ravine stalking this poor antelope. And there it goes. And let's take it back to the ravine because I want to eat in peace. I don't know why. I'm wondering what these antelope are thinking. It's like, oh, there goes Albert. I never really liked him anyway. But look at this. Look at this. It's got a happy ending. This is why. Part of the reason I'm showing it to you. So this one gets away. Not all hunting, even by a leopard on an antelope, is successful. This is an incredibly complicated task, filled with peril and failures. And leopards don't get a huge number of samples they can't do millions of trials like AlphaGo can. AlphaGo did a total number of trials. I think I calculated it would take something like 33 lifetimes of Lee Sedol to do the amount of practice, or maybe it was an order of magnitude higher. Anyways, a lot. But we all know about the sample inefficiency of model-free RL, that sample inefficiency problem. So what do leopards, and indeed many endotherms, including ourselves, do to mitigate the low number of samples problem? Well, here's something to think about, and it's another video, and this is a little unpleasant, but it makes, I think, an important point about one way that animals that have to put a lot of parental investment into their young mitigate this problem. Oh, I need audio here. Let me get the audio, sorry.
The cheetah mother invests more time than any other in teaching her cubs to kill. stalking and chasing are instinctive, but the killing technique must be learnt.
The mother cheetah released the gazelle fawn for the cubs to practice with. The wild cheetah cubs had already developed an excellent paw sweep, which they used repeatedly to knock the gazelle fawn down.
So this is, I think an important clue as to like what animals have to do in the low sample limit, and where mortal dangers are at hand with bad decision making. So I guess a question I would ask is planning an adaptive response to needing to learn efficiency with low or no samples in ontogenetic time, particularly in cases where those samples can be costly? And it's interesting that really the most notable cases of planning, and of course we're still trying to figure out which animals plan, but it seems to be restricted to mammals and birds, as shown here, and maybe even a subset of those. And one thing that's characteristic of mammals and birds as endotherms, they're both endotherms, is that if you look at their brain mass to body mass slope, they have an offset from pretty much all the ectotherms, cold-blooded animals, fish, all our ancestral lineages, amphibians, and the gap is not small. I mean, here's a 43-fold difference at this end of the spectrum, so order of magnitude at least in general. So that's a big difference. Factor of 10 more brain mass per body mass. And just for a sense of this, here's a goldfish brain, 0.5 millimeter or 0.5 centimeter scale bar, whale shark, here's a cat, here's a domestic sheep. The brains of endotherms have gotten very, very big, and they run hot, meaning, and an analysis of that has shown that endothermic brains run 6 times faster than ectothermic because of the increased rate of biochemical processing. And so, a lot of time and effort goes into the young of these endothermic animals to train up their learning systems so that they can live a long time and not make incorrect decisions of mortal consequence. So summary, plan-based action control is a biological phenomenon that appears well suited to non-habitizable conditions in volatile environments. The animals in which planning may occur use lots of energy to build and maintain brains that are an order of magnitude larger than ancestral vertebrates, where planning seems to either be diminished or possibly absent. With long lives and more parental investment comes a need to learn with very few samples and avoid deadly situations, often ones with partial observability, conditions that may favor planning where, as we've seen, structures like the medial PFC that track latent variables play apparently a critical role. Thank you. Yes.
Thanks, Malcolm. I'm really enjoying this playing Terminator with mice. So the question is, if you were to do the same maze with fish in the water, and I have a pond so I can see what they do, wouldn't you observe something very similar? Or to put a bit what you were proposing here to the test is, to what extent is what we're seeing simply prediction of where prey may go that distinguish itself, which is an approximation of, so to speak, a high-level planner working out the plan that it is. So the question is, do we really need to be able to plan everything out in a flexible simulation? Or is it simply that, ancestral techniques give us the thing that if you predict where the predator is, that's good enough planning for you, but you don't know anything about the planning anymore, you just predict.
So the difference between straightforward prediction versus planning is that that's kind of the nub of the issue, or?
Yeah, because you can think about a lot of planning problems.
Mm-hmm.
If you take the flexibility of the planning away, break down to first step decision-making process
Yes.
of pure prediction. So it
Right,
may look
okay.
like planning, but it's
now
just
I see
prediction.
what you're saying. Okay, so first of all, I would have loved to have done these tests in fish, as I spent so many years in fish, and so it was very comfortable. And I kind of was loath to move to mammals for a variety of reasons. But the evidence for planning in fish is very patchy. And it seemed like a long road to hoe. And also, here's the thing, is the fishes where this is being even explored at all aren't related to us. They are teleos, and teleos diverged from Sarcopterygians 400 million years ago. And so really, if we want to, like, if we're interested at least in the ancestral condition, we should look at lungfish planning and other such Sarcopterygians. So what happens with teleos, one of the reasons they're so speciose, is that they have a super dynamic brain. And so, for example, weakly electric fish seem to possibly have a spatial map. They have almost no olfactory lobe, and it seems to have gone to the dorsal pallium. And Len Mailer in Ottawa has some evidence that they use, because they have this very short range electrosense, that they might be building up complicated spatial maps with that. But going more to the nub of the conceptual problem. So if you were to do a prediction on your adversary, and it's one shot sort of, okay, it's going to go there, as opposed to maintaining a probability distribution, which is what I think might be happening, but again, just preliminarily, I think maintenance of a belief cloud, like a cloud of particles, may get very challenging for animals that can do sort of like the fish-like thing of, okay, there's my predator, it's moving in that direction, and maybe I don't see it the full way, but it's kind of a more single path prediction.
But you can still be Bayesian in your prediction
Mm-hmm.
and predict a distribution.
Yes.
And it will still look, in some ways, like planning from what you showed.
Yes, and so then, you know, if they're able to do that in complex conditions, then that can definitely start to be planning. And yeah, I just don't know. The evidence is limited, and so you asked me, do I think that would happen in fish? I haven't seen examples where I would believe it to be the case, but yeah. Any other? All right.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Good. David.
Can you run that experiment in fish?
What's that?
Can you run that experiment in fish?
Our next speaker needs no introduction. David Redish from University of Minnesota.
I've always wanted somebody to introduce me by saying, hey, here's this guy we found on the street, he should give a talk. So I think I've finally gotten close. There we go. Although apparently I can't get my laptop up. Let's try it, come on. Are we there?
Have you connected your? That doesn't work.
Sometimes this is. Yep, there we go. Okay. All right. So I want to start by thanking Kerman and Malcolm for giving me the opportunity to be part of this. It's been fantastic. This has really been fun. And this is the first time I've ever actually rewritten my talk on the stage. So we'll see how it goes. What I want to do today is actually, because of time and because I want to leave time for discussion, I'm going to kind of play debate and just throw data at you, and I'm not going to go into detail. But any detail that anybody wants, I'm very happy to dive deep and go in and show whatever. But at this point, I kind of want to make 6 points that we know from all the work that we've talked about. And all of the papers are, of course, available on the lab website. So the first statement, which is really important, is that we know that the brain has multiple decision-making systems. And the important point about these decision-making systems is that they actually represent information in different ways, and they perform different algorithms, which is exactly the thing that Mark was bringing up when he was talking a couple of minutes ago. And we know that. I'm going to show you some examples where the different systems represent past, present, and future, that is, memory, perception, and goals differently. The important point here is that each of these decision systems are, I was going to say optimized, but in this crowd I won't, but is better suited for different situations. And so what we're going to find is that under certain conditions, the animals do what I call deliberation on this slide, but it's really planning. So the first thing I do want to say, just because we've talked a little about this, and Jessica brought up the really important point about that there are different kinds of planning, quote and unquote, is that you have planning in terms of the action in the moment, and offline planning where you are learning about your environment. And I want to kind of point out, I know it's gotten mentioned a couple of times, but the hippocampus really does separate these. When the animal is awake, paying attention to the world, moving around, frozen in fear, the hippocampus is in a 7 hertz theta state. And in that state, what we have is representations of the world that are where you are and then sweep forward to the next goal. However, offline, and this is both in wake and sleep, and there are subtle differences between wake and sleep, but things like the animal's just got its food and it's sitting around kind of nibbling on the food, or it's, asleep, you actually see these sequences exploring all kinds of possibilities, and this is during sharp waves, during LIA, which is called Large Amplitude Irregular Activity, which I always think of as not theta. And there are, again, subtleties to where these different components are and where they occur. I just want to make one interesting point because, of course, as you can only publish so much in any article. These 2 articles from Anupam Gupta, one in 2010 and one in 2012, are the same data. So the fact that the theta sequence go to the next goal and the sharp waves are connecting goals across is particularly interesting because, of course, this is, as I said, the same experiment. So what I want to talk today about, or what I want to kind of drop a few points on, is this sweeps to the goal. And I'm basically going to just tell you these things, but we can go into depth. We know that the sweeps alternate between goals when the animal is unsure about what the goal is, but they proceed directly to whatever the goal the animal's planning to when they're sure. And this was in the original Johnson-Redish paper, but it's been shown most beautifully recently in really elegant data by the K paper from 2020, from Lauren Frank's lab. We know that these sequences will skip a goal to go to the next goal. That's Andrew Wickenheiser's paper. One of my favorite experiments, since we had the 420 earlier, we'll drop the cannabinoids. David Raub, when he was in Yuri Bujaki's lab, did an experiment where they put cannabinoid agonists into the hippocampus, the effect of which is to disrupt the sequences, and the animals show much, much more unsurety, right? They're basically stoned. And what you get is the animal essentially saying, what's next? I don't know. And so it kind of looks around. I mean, you think about cannabinoids. It really does seem to work on that. And if anybody wants to come and actually do that experiment, looking at the sweeps and manipulating it in my lab, come tell me, because that's an experiment I really want to kind of push on. And then the other thing I want to say about this is that clonidine, which, let me get this right, it's an alpha adrenergic autoreceptor agonist, which has the effect of decreasing the amount of noradrenaline in the system. And what it does is we know that decreasing noradrenaline shifts an animal into exploitation modes. What happens in these sweeps is clonidine basically shifts an animal into a mode where it only sweeps in one direction, as if the animal's doing mental exploitation, not mental exploration. One of the important points about these kind of plans, if this really is a search, they have to evaluate it, and it's not enough to know what is going to happen if I go left. You have to actually say, is that something I want? And we know that in the ventral striatum and the orbitofrontal cortex, you see extra reward activity at these moments that are consistent with alternating values. This is work from my lab, but also there's beautiful work from Joni Wallace's lab on monkeys showing that orbitofrontal cortex does this. What I want to point out, though, is that if we then go to the other side of the puzzle, where we're talking about more automated or model-free behaviors, what we actually would predict is a very different underlying representation and algorithm. We're not going to look for sweeps going to the goal. What we should see instead is momentary representation of take this state, take an action. And Anne Graybiel has been finding this thing that her lab calls task bracketing. This is from a Smith and Graybiel 2013 paper, where they see that as the animal develops develops automation, they see the development of this task initiation moment, and it is inversely related to behavioral signals of deliberation. We do replicate that, by the way. But what I want to point out is that there's a really interesting experiment we can do to test what is going on at that moment. This is work by Paul Cunningham in my lab, where he realized we could ask at that moment, is it a representation of the future, some sort of successor representation type thing, or is it a representation of the past, which would be a state response model-free representation. And what we found very definitively, this is from a task where animals sometimes go left, sometimes go right, sometimes alternate. On the alternation trials, we dissociate past and future at the moment when the animal's at the start point. So they're kind of at the bottom of the maze, about to take off to take their ballistic journey forward. What we find is representation of where they came from. And that is highly significantly retrospective, not prospective, which is exactly what you'd predict from a model-free story, not a model-based, not a planning story. I also want to point out that what we find is we find that prefrontal cortical signals seem to represent strategy. And this is something that I found very, very interesting and to me quite shocking until it's one of those data points, you see it, and you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So this is work by Brendan Haas when he was in the lab. And what we were asking is, could we predict whether the hippocampus was going to throw a long sequence to the goal or just kind of be local? And what we found is, yes, we could predict very well on a given theta cycle whether the representation was basically part of a long sequence or pretty much a little kind of local, just what's right in front of me. Unfortunately, when we then looked over all the other theta cycles on that lap, we also could predict. And when we shuffle within the lap, we find that we can still do great prediction. But if we shuffle between laps, it drops to chance. What's happening is on any given lap, the animal is either running a planning system or a model-free system. So what we typically see in these tasks is that early in the experience, once the animal kind of knows what the structure of the world is, maybe they don't know exactly what to do yet, we see a lot of deliberation. We see sweeps going back and forth in the hippocampus, representation of reward in ventral striatum and orbitofrontal cortex. As the animal knows what to do within the task, those sweeps only go in one direction, and as the animal then automates the behavior, what we see is the hippocampus becomes very local, the ventral striatum and orbitofrontal cortex show ramping activity to the goal, which makes sense because you have this continuous state that's getting better and better, and you see this task bracketing behavior in the dorsolateral striatum. Now, a really important point here, which kind of gets to, I added this after Jane's talk, so we have GAC actually interactions, is what we see is these planning systems reappear when the task contingencies change. So for example, we have a task where an animal runs left for reward, right for reward, or alternate, and then halfway through the session we flip it. So it's been getting food when it goes left, and now that doesn't work anymore. All of a sudden, the animal kicks back into a planning mode. So the planning seems to be when you have non-stationary contingencies. So that brings up this kind of last point I want to drop here, which is, when does biology want to deliberate? Deliberation requires you know the structure of the world. So if you're in a truly novel environment, deliberation isn't going to help you. But if you know the structure of the world, but you're not sure what to do on it, you can run those sequences forward and figure out, plan what you could do. So when the contingencies change, or as I like to point out, when the action is dangerous or fraught, as Malcolm was just pointing out. I love this example of Stephen Colbert looking and deciding not to do bungee jumping. But when you find that the behavior is automatable, that is, the world is stable, you can recognize the pattern, you can decide what to do there, you know that you want to take that action identically every time, something like hitting a baseball, then the system shifts into this more automated, model-free system. So kind of leaving you with a set of the 6 points to take home, the brain has multiple decision-making systems. Planning systems differentiate online and offline online planning and offline map exploration. Planning systems include representations of the sequence to the goal and an evaluation of the outcome. Non-planning systems include representations of the current state, not the future expectations, and there's no representation of that future goal. And prefrontal representations are doing this on a lap-by-lap basis, really strongly suggesting that you are, in fact, flipping between systems. And it's the question of is it a spectrum or not is a really interesting question. Right now, my hunch is it's not, but science is interesting, and I've been wrong before. I'll be wrong again. So I think that's a really interesting thing to talk about. I do want to drop one thing that I think is a dirty little secret of all the work that I've been doing, and I think is important. It was something that came up when I was talking to Manish Sahani at lunch today and other people since then. And I want to point out, 6th point, we plan when things are variable but not too variable. The thing I want to drop is we do not yet know how to translate those plans and that evaluation into action. We've been assuming it's some sort of integrate to threshold type thing. We've not been able to find it, and we've been looking for almost 15 years now. So one of the things that I think would be really interesting, particularly from this crowd, is there a different action selection process given plans that we should go look for? Because if there is, maybe we can find it. Because I don't think it's a simple integrate to threshold story. At least it's not. We've not been able to find it. And of course, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but eventually you start to get worried that it's not there. So I'm going to stop there, and I was going to leave this up as a point for discussion, but we can also just go to black if people want, whatever. Herman, you're deciding.
Yes. First questions.
Okay, yes, first question. Yeah.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes. Excellent.
Thanks. Yeah.
So when I came into this GAC, I thought it's boring because motor control is about planning and we know how to do that, sort of. And now I'm getting really excited about this. So thank you for this. So one point I have here is, to me, the notion of planning also involves not just exploration, but you have data about the past, this hotel, and now you set up with a new task, and without revisiting this environment, I can formulate a plan of what to do. What evidence can you give us in your animal context? I'm sure you have that experiment somewhere. I just wanted to see it.
So there are two answers to that. There are data where people have seen observational experiments where rats will look at another rat doing a task, and then you'll see that the cells will represent that other rat, that other location, which you then can put your rat on and discover what the play cells look like. We've seen a lot. What we've seen in our data is that we can change the contingency of the task, and the animals will then be able to change it very quickly. So you say the Morris water maze. The Morris water maze is in fact it was literally designed for this. It's a great example. One of my pet peeves in neuroscience is we never talk about the fact that experiments derive from theory. The Morris water maze derived from the cognitive map theory very explicitly. So Keefe and Nadel predicted you would have a cognitive map, and that meant you could have a novel goal. And so the Morris water maze, for those who don't know, is you take a rat, you throw it into cold water, and there's a hidden platform. And the rat will swim around to find the platform, and then will learn to go directly. You can take a rat, put it on that platform, throw it in the maze, it will go directly to the platform. And there's no local cue, it's the point. So the Morris water maze is actually an example, and there's beautiful data about how you can switch the platform locations, and rats will be able to learn that, or to be able to do that immediately. If you have a hippocampal lesion, they don't learn that. In terms of going through a novel kind of path, people have been trying to do that. It's one of those subtle things that it's really hard to get animals to do things because they don't listen to you. They're kind of like students sometimes. You know, the animals don't always listen when you tell them what to do. I know Matt Vandermeer had a data that that his lab presented at an SFN poster one year. I don't know what the status of it is, where they had a U-shaped maze and there was a bar in the middle, and so the animals couldn't reach the bar, but they would go the long way, and then they would make the shortcut. So that's the closest I know to what you're asking.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have time for one more. That's it. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, there you go. You're leading the discussion. And now David is going to lead the discussion for the rest of the workshop. And before you go, we're going to ask you one more question, so don't go just right after.
So, I don't know, I said we didn't do enough discussion, so Herman said I had to lead the discussion. But mostly I think what we should do is, let's start with the question of planning and does planning exist on a spectrum? What do people think? Let's get some, do we want to take 2 minutes and have a discussion, or do we want to let's have people just come up to the mic and make comments, or do we have access to, is Jane still here? Jane and Nathaniel, are they still there?
Yes.
You're here.
Cool. I mean, let's start with that issue of does planning exist on a spectrum? And what do people think about that? I mean, I presented some evidence that it doesn't, but that's really limited evidence.
So I have a comment.
Good.
If you
Wait,
can
Aldo
hear
has
me.
a statement. Go ahead, Aldo, say that.
What are the dimensions of the spectrum?
What's the
depth of the states, the depth of the planning?
right? So what's the depth of the states? What's the depth of the planning? Nathaniel, you were going to say.
Well, I was going to suggest maybe a different, I'm not even sure spectrum is the word, but the thing that struck me through a lot of these talks was the range of things that planning contributes to, or that mental simulation contributes to, that isn't just figuring out the consequences of your actions, like your immediately contemplated action, like should I bungee jump? So like I think one of Jessica's points is that planning does a lot to help you build representations or mental simulation does a lot to do that when you're acquiring a task. And I think a lot of the conversation around Malcolm's talk was about how could be involved in sort of tracking the situation and locating predators separate from figuring out what to do with that. And so maybe a different spectrum is sort of what's planning or what's mental simulation contributing to the organism.
Do you think all of that's planning? I mean, I think those are fundamentally mathematically different operations, both in terms of how they work and how they change the system. So if you're talking about thinking about what's next and what goals there are in the next option, I think that's a very different mathematical operation, both in terms of its consequence and in terms of its mechanism, than updating your map and kind of learning on your map. And I don't know that, I'm a little concerned about using the fact that we use the English word planning for it is, you know, the classic psychology problem of we seem to not be willing to make up words. I think those are different.
I guess I think they're different outcomes of the same algorithmic operation, or different aspects of what. That's why I was trying to say mental simulation, not planning, right? I think one of the surprising things, I thought planning was all about, running simulations in your brain is all about figuring out what to do, as you're saying. But I think what I'm hearing is that it can do lots of other stuff too, right? Which also contributes to action selection, but not in the way, I think I agree with you, it's not what we have in mind when we say planning.
Good. There's a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, or to maybe pose that you could think of this spectrum, instead of it as a spectrum, as a composition. That maybe you're learning sets of skills, you're planning something, but once you've learned it, it becomes model-free, but now you can compose.
Wait, can we make sure the mic's on? Yeah, because that was good. Yeah, say that again. That was great.
Yes. So I'm wondering, instead of thinking of it strictly as a spectrum horizontally, so to speak, but think of it hierarchically, that you may be doing planning to learn some particular skill, but then it becomes model-free, and then that's an element of a next level, higher level of planning. So you think of it compositionally instead of it as a spectrum.
I think that's a great question and a great comment. I think a really important thing to remember is that the whole idea that there are these two systems actually goes back to the fact that if you lesion the key parts of the planning system, people, HM in particular, could learn model-free just fine. And in fact, there's a whole slew of rat data, in fact, multiple species data, that if you destroy, if you damage hippocampus, that the animals will learn at the same rate as long as they're getting the reward sequence at the right sequence, right? So a lot of the things that you do see that the hippocampal planning, or the hippocampal system, let's call it that, does provide is it provides jump start to the more automated behaviors to get you to the right answer. But if you don't have that, then you'll learn at the same rate without a hippocampus. There is an interesting question of whether offline sleep replay will also train that, which is a fascinating question. There's data that supports it. But yeah, I think we need to remember that those systems also work without as well. Good. Do you guys have comments? You guys have a mic too. Oh, there's questions over here.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think one kind of emerging interesting way that these could be considered on a spectrum is theories like from Pire about model-free being a prior for a policy, and you know, them being combined in that way. It might explain the kind of gradual convergence to the prior being better and better for the tasks that you're doing, and ways in which they could be integrated and combined. And that's kind of an emerging idea in like automaticity and control, kind of research in the cognitive control end as well. And I think that might be something that's potentially productive. Not two different strategies, but two different contributions to the same strategy that are useful in different situations.
It's an excellent point. And I'll point out that current theories of the neuroscience of it suggest that both the model-free and both the dorsal striatal and hippocampal systems are getting their state representations from the cortex. So they're kind of using very similar state representations, and that the hippocampal, both the replay and the planning components, are activating cortical imagination, which suggests that there is cortical overlap in that, right? That the cortical state representation going to a model-free action selection is also the same cortical system that is being activated in imagination during planning type states.
I think we have time for one more.
Can I say something
about
to answer the question about the spectrum? I guess, well, I do notice a difference in terms of the way we're talking about planning when it comes to, for instance, animals or agents and humans. And I think that that's why I originally brought up the question, is that it does seem like, I mean, it's difficult to tell with animals and like my personal experience with agents to try and pinpoint if explicit planning is being done, because there is so much entanglement with, especially like if they're doing a task, of them like doing just appropriate representation. So I guess how can we really be sure that, for instance, I mean, David was mentioning that you know they haven't been able to find like how are these plans actually translated into action? And so therefore, like, how can you be sure that that's planning as like a human might think of planning, and isn't just a bunch of heuristics that that they learn because they have been in really similar situations before?
So two things. One, we should always remember that the planning, at least in fact, all planning uses memory, right? When we are creating any imagined future, we are building it out of memories, and we are constructing it out of memories. But even science fiction futures are built out of our understanding of each other and how we think about physics and things like that. But I do think that, so one thing that was brought up to me earlier today was that planning also, we should be thinking about how do we get past the sub-goals, like Mark was saying, that a lot of planning is, and I think it was Ida who brought it up yesterday or a couple of days ago, that when you plan your trip, like when I planned my trip to here, I didn't think about the steps I was going to take to go out of my house to get into the car. I said, okay, I need a flight, right? So you have this kind of hierarchical sub-goaling part that is part of planning that has been very hard to do in non-human animals. But I will say, I think there's some data, and I don't think I could say it, I could describe it offhand, but maybe some of the DeepMind people know, that I thought that some of the Zeb Kurth-Nelson and Ray Dolan, that kind of work, had been finding some stuff in MEG, or somebody in there had been doing that. I'm trying to remember who it was. In humans, where they were actually doing novel plan sequences. But what we do know in non-human animals is that these sequences that we have will go past a goal to the next goal. So they will, in fact, skip goals. So if we have a rat that is going from, say, goal 1 to goal 2 to goal 3, and sometimes stopping at goal 2 and sometimes going past it, when they're about to go past it, the sequences plan to the goal, past it, and when they're about to stop, the sequences stop. So they are in fact relating not just to the representation of the moment, but to the representation of that future as well. And they are in sequence. I mean, this is a really important point, that we're not seeing that the cell is a burst like a successor representation would be. It's actually a sequence in order that goes ahead of the animal. So maybe you could think of the whole theta cycle as a successor representation, but the spiking within the theta cycle is in order, which is, I think, an important point.
I think we're running out of time.
Oh, okay.
I'll just add one point.
Yeah, please.
So I think we'd be remiss not to mention the point that Karamati made in the 2016 paper, that as you give animals less and less time, they progressively go to more and more habit cache responses. And we've been doing, just recently, been experimenting with changing the depth level on our algorithm for the stuff you saw in our talks. And what we're seeing is a pretty smooth degradation of survival rate as we reduce the depth of planning. Now, we haven't gotten to the point where we say increase the velocity of the robot, because we're already pushing it pretty hard, but like trying to do a manipulation where we give the mouse less time to plan and see if we can degrade it to the point where we see, say, just habit emerging again. But I do suspect that would happen.
Try putting the robot closer or farther from the mouse. I bet that would change the time that the mouse has available. I bet you could smoothly change where the robot was.
Yeah, the thing is, if it can see the robot when it comes out, it won't come out of the port, so we got to kind of get it hidden first. But
if they're thirsty enough, they'll go.
All right, that's all, folks. So this was great. Thank you so much for listening to us and for participating in the discussions and for your great questions.
Thank you.